joining this webinar today. I'm going to give you mostly just context about the project, about why this project is needed and what we're trying to do in it. And then Warwick will be following up from NFF with a bit more detail about how the project fits into some broader program of work that's happening as well. So I'll share my screen now, if you just bear with me for 1 second while I do that. Okay. Everyone can see that okay? I'm assuming yes. Okay, yep, good, right. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to give you a project introduction. Warwick will follow me with a bit more perspective. I'll pause briefly after mine for some questions, but we're going to have plenty of time at the end after both myself and Warwick have spoken to have an extended Q&A and talk us more detail about the project and any questions that you might have. So why the project? Why are we doing it? What is the need for the project? So in March, just before all the coronavirus lockdowns started to happen and gatherings were limited, the Australian Institute of Company Directors had their governance summit, which they have every year, where all the leading issues in terms of governance of companies are discussed, and the new trends or important trends are detailed in terms of strategy and what boards need to think about. The 5 takeaways that the AICD put out about that governance summit this year, obviously COVID-19 was just emerging, so no surprise that was there. Data becoming really overwhelming in terms of the amount of data that is coming to boards and how boards deal with that. But the other 3 out of the 5 top takeaways for the governance summit in 2020 were all in some way related to the broader suite of issues around the need for this project and the context about that this project exists within. And those being purpose, in that purpose has sort of really overtaken culture as something that a board focuses on in language around why the company exists. It exists for a purpose, and that purpose is increasingly to do or encompasses language around things like sustainability, about protection of the environment. And so, there is a very strong focus around purpose that is being focused on more and more, that encompasses a lot of the issues that this project is dealing with. Climate change, again, a really big environmental consideration. This project is not directly about climate change, but it is part of that suite of things that go into sustainable agriculture that I'll get to later on in a few slides, that is very much related to a lot of the mechanisms that we're looking at as part of this project. And the 5th one being environmental, social and governance, ESG for boards, which is, again, encompasses climate change, it encompasses other environmental measures, but it is that broad suite of things now which are being really focused on and managed and measured really intensively by boards to demonstrate their sustainability credentials. So what is, and I'm going to focus a little bit now on that last one about ESG metrics, because this really feeds into what this project, part of what this project is trying to do and provide. What are ESG metrics? If you haven't heard of them, I'm sure most of you have heard of them by now. Environmental, social and governance metrics are used to measure the social impact of companies and are utilised to inform decision-making in investments. The environmental component of that's pretty straightforward, talking about climate change, resource depletion, waste, pollution, deforestation. I won't spend too much time on the other 2, but social, you're talking about human rights, slavery issues, governance, about bribery and corruption, executive pay, so on. So why are those ESG metrics becoming really important? One of the primary things from a corporate perspective is that you know, along with just aligning with societal expectations of corporate responsibility, which is obviously really important, there is increasing evidence now that compliance to ESG principles within a company is having a positive relationship to the corporate financial performance. So that obviously is driving a real focus and driving an understanding of the importance of delivering on ESG metrics. And there's a lot of data now that is starting to demonstrate that. So that's just a graph that is showing that funds which are concentrating on companies that are delivering ESG metrics are starting to perform above standard indexes of stock market performance. So it's giving that demonstration that the companies that are performing better on ESG are performing better than the average company within the stock market. So what that means is that increasingly there's changing priorities from investors and fund managers and governance of companies in terms of what they're focusing on, and particularly in assessing new investment opportunities. And that's showing there that ESG performance is increasing rapidly compared to even operational expertise in terms of the sorts of things that a fund manager will be looking at to assess the worthiness of investment. And it's flowing into the total amount of funds invested, obviously. So most of the world's largest asset managers are now signatories to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. And that graph there shows that assets under management of those companies that are sold up to that PRI scheme is now $86 trillion. And when you look only 10 years ago, it was 20 trillion. That's a huge increase and a huge understanding of the importance of delivering against ESG metrics. So what does that mean for agriculture? Well, starting globally to begin with, there's a huge focus, an increasing focus on that now with global agricultural and food supply chains. So for instance, Walmart, everyone has heard or knows about Walmart, one of the world's biggest agricultural food retailers. And in its last year's annual report, its ESG focus was really strong, and it laid out heaps of goals relating to sustainable supply chains. So for instance, it's aiming to source 100% of all its seafood essentially from organisations that have been third-party certified as sustainable. It's also wanting to source 100% of bananas and pineapples from farms that have been third-party certified. Same with wood, paper and pulp products, and it's also getting into land conservation to match the area that it's developing itself with its store footprint. What about Australia? So just as a really recent example, this is only last month, there was a bit of publicity about this. CBH Group, which for the grain growers will know who CBH is, big West Australian based grain cooperative, shipped its first bulk shipment of barley, 27,000 tonnes from Albany to Vietnam that had been accredited through the International Sustainability and Carbon Certification Scheme. Now, the barley in that shipment attracted a $5 a tonne premium for the growers that had grown it. And CBH are now saying that for their large corporate brewers, that they've gone from 0 to 30% now of those corporate brewers that are making compliance to that scheme a supply prerequisite for them to be interested in trading in that barley. So if we have a look at that International Sustainability of Carbon Certification Program, which is an international program that CBH have adopted as their sustainability accreditation method, and we come back to when we look at the principles that they're working to, immediately come back to those ESG requirements or categorisation. So ecological sustainability, and in there, first point, biodiversity, protection of land, high biodiversity value, but also social sustainability, and also governance issues and compliance with laws and international treaties. So in terms of rewarding Australian farmers for sustainability compliance, in that particular example with CBH, there's a couple of ways that they're being rewarded. They're being rewarded by, first of all, just being able to continue to access the markets, as you know, being a market requirement to supply barley that has been accredited as being sustainable. But also in that particular circumstance, they've been directly rewarded by a premium that is attached to the grain that is being supplied through that scheme. So the other thing that's happening though, and there's other ways of you know, thinking about how farmers are rewarded for sustainability. This is a diagram from last year's Commonwealth Bank annual report that I'm sure many of you may have seen by now. They commissioned Energetics, the consultancy company Energetics, to look at their agricultural loan book and how much at risk it was from climate change. And if you look, there's three sectors there: grains, livestock and dairy. And the top pictures are, if there's no adaptation to climate change, how much farm profitability is going to change. And if you look across, you know, it's basically all brown, sort of, you know, a huge impact on farm profitability. But the bottom pictures are if there's adaptation. So if measures are taken and farms adapt, then the picture is a lot better. It's still pretty worrying when you look at livestock in the middle of Australia and grains in parts of Western Australia. There's still a bit of brown there. It's not particularly good, but it's a lot better than without adaptation. So what does that mean in terms of how Commonwealth Bank are going to be thinking? And this is sort of getting to how else you are rewarded for sustainability. And one of the other ways that you're rewarded is just by maintaining your business conditions, by being able to maintain adequate finance, adequate insurance at rates that are still, you know, you can maintain a business under. And what an organisation, I mean, this is just Commonwealth Bank because they're the ones that have got that out there in their annual report, but all banks, all insurance companies are going to be going through these same sorts of measures. So they've identified that, you know, there's going to be a lot of adaptation that's required. So schemes that demonstrate or provide evidence of that adaptation are going to be really important for them, demonstrating how they're mitigating their risk. So taking that back to their boards and being able to say, we're not under extreme risk in our ag loan book because we understand that adaptation will deliver good profitability results, and we have evidence that adaptation is being undertaken because of these schemes that farmers are participating in. And that's where we start to get to this project, and really the need for the project, the need for a scheme. When you start thinking about the sorts of evidence that is going to be required from banks to access markets, to get premiums, they're all going to be far more reliant on an evidence base than what we've seen in the past, where market access may have just been because of the perception that Australian agriculture was clean and green. So last year, the Australian government announced funding for the implementation of a farm biodiversity scheme, and they tasked the National Farmers Federation with administering that scheme. It's part of a broader body of work which is around developing an Agriculture Stewardship Package. And you probably all would have heard by now the Agriculture Minister, David Littleproud, talk quite often about his desire to see Australian farmers better rewarded for stewarding the land, for good land management. What we're conducting now, and what this webinar is part of, this is the AFI work, is the very first phase of all that work, working towards an Agriculture Stewardship Package. And because it is the very first phase, it's all about discovery. It's all about just understanding what is going on globally and in Australia around sustainability schemes, biodiversity schemes, the sorts of market conditions, the sorts of drivers that are really accelerating the development of the need for these sorts of schemes. So consultation is a really important part of what we've been doing through this first phase of the project. So just to recap, the primary objective of this Australian Farm Biodiversity Certification Scheme project is to identify critical success factors and recommend a strategic plan for further investigation and development of a trial for such a scheme. Because the subsequent phases, after we've done this first piece of work, will actually be developing and applying a trial for farm biodiversity certification. Why biodiversity? When I started, I talked about ESG, which is obviously encompassing of a lot broader suite of measures around sustainability and also social and governance measures as well. Really, it's because a biodiversity verification or recognition scheme can incentivise and reward best practice land management. And as I said before, we've all heard the Minister by now talking about his desire to better reward Australian farmers for good land management. So even though biodiversity is only one of a suite of factors that go into what we understand to be sustainable farming, which protects and builds the natural capital that we rely on as farmers, that natural capital asset that we use to deliver both goods and services and ecosystem services to the public. Biodiversity is only part of that. We can also talk about carbon, we can talk about water management, we can talk about soil health, we can talk about clean air. There's a whole lot of stuff there that is part of that broader picture of sustainable farming. And you know, here's a few more of those there that do go up to make to that sustainable farming picture and protection of natural capital. But it is important to remember that the sorts of what goes into a scheme that rewards farmers for protecting biodiversity in terms of measurement systems, in terms of market mechanisms, is often going to be very similar and very applicable to other parts of sustainable farming. So while the scheme is focused on biodiversity, it is obviously fitting within that bigger picture of sustainable farming and is going to be very applicable and relevant to just rewarding good farm management generally and sustainable farm management. So as I said, this whole first phase of this project is about discovery, it's about consultation, it's about understanding the sorts of schemes that are out there already and extracting from those schemes the bits that are working well, understanding the bits that aren't working well, understanding what needs to be in an Australian farm biodiversity certification scheme that makes it relevant to the rest of the world, makes it relevant to all the existing schemes, and most important of all, makes it relevant to farmers so that it can be embraced and can be adopted. So I'm just going to run through quickly a few of the schemes, just really as an example of the breadth of things that are out there rather than any particular features or particular sectors as opposed to any others. So the Smart Cane BMP is an industry-owned program managed through cane growers with support from the Queensland Government. It is a voluntary scheme, and I should emphasise that everything we're talking about here is voluntary. This Australian Farm Biodiversity Certification Scheme will obviously be a voluntary scheme. It's an outcome-based approach. Farmers are rewarded for delivering outcomes. And importantly, very importantly, the last point there is that it links with the global Bonsucro standard. Now, the Bonsucro standard is a global sugar sustainability standard that is being increasingly used by the likes of Coca-Cola and Nestle and others that are having, or needing to demonstrate the sustainability of the sugar industry globally as it comes under pressure as being perceived to be damaging to the environment. And so that's a real driver for a scheme like that, is the link to a global standard such as Bonsucro. The Australian Dairy Industry Sustainability Report, again, really linking to international standards, and the whole design of it is about demonstrating the dairy industry sustainability credentials in the context of being able to develop new markets and access trade agreements. And so as a result of that, it's all about surveys that demonstrate the industry's credentials rather than individual farm level certifications. There's lots and lots of global programs and global standards that are developing, and this is really just one of them as an example, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Its standards are measurable, based on science and expert opinion, and producers have the option of choosing from lots of different certification bodies. So it's all just about meeting those sustainability standards. It's not necessarily about the particular scheme or certification that you're in to get there. It's just about delivering those outcomes. So, the industry has, based on science, delivered a whole lot of targets, and then you get certified for reaching those targets. There are also some significant global programs, such as the GAP, or Good Agricultural Practice Standard. And this one's being developed specifically for New Zealand practices, but can be applied globally. Again, it's a system that meets a whole range of different targets. So it's not just being applied to one particular area of sustainability. It talks about soil, nutrients, irrigation, waterways, biodiversity, waste, energy, emissions, and so on. There are also frameworks developing which are not sectorally or even agriculturally targeted at all, which are more just about defining, understanding, and measuring the environment. And so the Accounting for Nature framework is a good example of that, which is a framework that provides a common methodology for measuring the condition of environmental assets. So, and understanding whether that environmental asset is improving or degrading. So, for instance, a sectorally based scheme might have a target for water quality, for instance, and that scheme may use the Accounting for Nature framework to as a way of measuring the water quality, so it is consistent with any other scheme that may be measuring water quality as well. But the target would be set through the sectorally based scheme in terms of what they're trying to achieve. So across all of those schemes, what we're trying to do is extract the key things that are working or not working and that need to go into a scheme that would be applicable for a whole of Australia-based farm biodiversity certification scheme. Now, just as a way of thinking about grouping all the success factors that apply across those schemes, we've got 6 really broad areas that we're thinking about. The first one is the standards and criteria of the scheme. So, given as I've just talked about, there are lots of pre-existing schemes and lots of developing activity in this place. How should a new scheme fit in with existing frameworks and best management practices? Because there is no desire, and it would be completely counterproductive, to be honest, to have a scheme that was attempting to take over or substitute or what's already there, particularly if what's already there is delivering the right outcomes and is being embraced. So it has to reference what's existing. It has to be relevant to everything that's going on, not make any more work if you're already in a scheme that's already existing. It just has to somehow reference everything that's going on already. The question about whether certification or verification standards are based on results or management is a question that comes up often, particularly in the Australian context and particularly in parts of Australia that have particularly variable climates, which is a lot of Australia, obviously. But, you know, and the difference between those two things, you know, if it's based on results, outcomes, at the end of the day, if you don't deliver those results, then you aren't rewarded. If it's based on management, then it's acknowledging that sometimes, despite best efforts, you know, even if you are the best farmer in the world, applying the best practices, things beyond your control, such as bushfires and droughts, may mean that your management practices don't deliver the result that you're trying to achieve. And, you know, if that is the case, then should you be penalised for that? So that's sort of some of the different things to consider around whether results-based schemes or management-based schemes are the most suitable for the particular sector, the particular industry, and the particular region of Australia that we might be thinking about. Farmer adoption. So there's no point building a scheme if it's completely irrelevant to farmers. If it can't be embraced, if it doesn't make sense, if it's just, there's no value proposition to applying it. So what can we learn from the schemes that are out there already about barriers to adoption? What's been making schemes attractive? What's been making schemes unattractive? And, you know, what other support could increase adoption of the scheme? The certification or verification question. Now, these things are different. Certification at one end of the scale is a very rigorous, very strict process around meeting a target. You know, you'll have a certification body that is certifying that you have met a target that is attached to the scheme. Verification, on the other hand, can even be a peer-to-peer process where you are just demonstrating that you are doing what you say you are doing. And there's a sliding scale between those two ends. And then, you know, who is that certification or verification actually belonging to? Is it belonging to the land or the land manager? And that's particularly relevant when we're starting to talk about those land management type environmental issues such as biodiversity, which are often about long-term outcomes that might be attached to a long-term change in status of the land. Market mechanisms. So there is a strong understanding or a strong desire that whatever scheme is developed will be commercially relevant and may even be, you know, completely market dependent. So how do you make that happen? What are the trade and economic factors that are critical if it is going to be a market-based scheme and implemented within a market-based scheme? Does it mean that you have to have tradable credits to make it market relevant, or can you do it just with ongoing annual payments? Measurement is something that comes up really regularly in the discussions as being an inadequacy of participating in environmental programs on farm. We don't really even have, in a lot of cases, the technology and the understanding to get baseline measurement, let alone be able to measure improvement or change in status from that baseline in an efficient way. So there may be methodologies that, you know, can measure it, but often they're completely uneconomic at any sort of scale that you would need for really broad scale adoption and participation by farmers. And if we do get good measurement systems, there's lots of questions around the data that is measured in terms of transparency, in terms of who has visibility of that data, and how that data is used to continuously develop the scheme. It's really important to understand that a scheme is very unlikely to be static. It would have to be continually developed, continually improved as the status of farms change and as practice change results in different outcomes. Schemes would have to be continually adapted. So how does that happen? How do you get the feedback loop operating successfully? So this project, to this point, as I said, has one of the main points has been a consultative process. So we've been doing all the review and the desktop work and understanding what's in existing schemes, but we're also just been speaking to as many people as we can to understand what the experience has been in participation of schemes so far, but also what people would like to see in the development of a new scheme. So the original intention was to hold a whole lot of forums, face-to-face forums around the country. Obviously, we couldn't do that with the coronavirus restrictions, so we've moved to doing those online. We've had really good numbers and good involvement and good engagement through all the webinars we've been holding. And I'm just going to quickly run through some of the key points of discussion that have been emerging out of those forums. Just some key themes we think have been coming out. So the first one there, a scheme will only be successful if broadly adopted, and will only be adopted if there is a reward, and the best reward is a market mechanism. Now, this isn't, all these points here, obviously there's been divergence of views. I'd say virtually there's not a single point where there has been 100% consensus. The points I'll be putting up here would be the dominant view, but by no means the only view. But certainly when it comes to market mechanism, most people have been putting forward that they would rather see that than an ongoing government-based scheme or a public scheme. Many people are recognising that to get a market scheme working, there would need to be some sort of government incentivisation or government intervention to establish it, but very much the preference was then for the longevity of the scheme that it needed to be very much market related. And then the second point there, that in the benefits that are delivered through the scheme, but particularly through market mechanisms, they had to outweigh the cost, because there would be a cost in participating. So for instance, as I just covered, the measurement cost, the verification cost, the certification cost. So whatever is delivered has to be more than that. There has to be a clear value proposition, and the value proposition has to be expressed in a way where the language is clear and consistent, so it can be understood by participants what they're actually delivering, what the purpose of participating in the scheme is. Now, in terms of the benefits that are delivered, one of the areas that comes up frequently as an area of complexity is additionality. Now, additionality is a concept that you have to improve on what's there already. So it can't just be a scheme that is paying you to continue what you're doing without improving the status of the environmental asset. It is a major area of complexity in relation to international schemes and accounting methodologies, and it's of most concern where we've been getting it raised as an area of concern mostly is particularly across the rangelands and areas of Australia where there are relatively intact landscapes that are being that are being managed by farmers. So as opposed to more degraded landscapes where there's obvious opportunities for improvement, rangelands and native landscapes where there's been very little modification of the landscape, there's a particular concern that if a scheme was all about additionality, then the opportunity to derive benefit out of that would be limited. Schemes need to be long-term with bipartisan agreement. And it's been brought up many times that existing schemes that have been parts of projects, so they've been basically project funded and they've had finite lifespans, they've very rarely had a life that has gone beyond that project funding. So if it's a 5-year project or a 10-year project, when the funds run out, the scheme stops. So that's really an indication of a couple of things in that, it's a clear indicator of the value proposition just being the financial value proposition. But it's also an indicator that perhaps the schemes that have been funded through projects like that have not delivered enough benefit that there's been an incentive for others to take up that scheme and run with it afterwards. A scheme should limit complexity, be transparent and authentic. So I mentioned before about how this scheme might reference other schemes. And that's come through really clearly in that already, particularly in some of the horticultural industries, growers might be needing to comply to 2 or 3 different schemes already just to participate in a particular value chain. And so another scheme would just be, very counterproductive and really not wanted at all. So whatever is put forward has to, at a minimum, not add work and, hopefully actually reduce the workload potentially by encompassing other schemes. And very importantly, and this is one of probably the most common factor that is coming back to us, is that farmers need to be involved in the creation of the scheme from the beginning, as well as in the assessment, collection and reporting of the outcomes for the scheme to be successful. So wherever any of the existing schemes have had any sort of broad uptake, it is inevitably when farmers have been at the core of the development of the schemes, and then preferably in the verification process. It's difficult for farmers to be involved in certification if it's a third-party certification scheme, but in the verification process, when it's a peer-to-peer type thing, then those are the ones that have been really successful. So that's it for me. I shall stop my screen share there. Hopefully that's been enough just to give you a broad overview of the context, of the background of some of the things that we've been doing so far and what we're trying to achieve out of this project. I'll probably just pause now if there's really just any points of clarification rather than in-depth discussion at this stage, because as I said, we'll have plenty of time for that once Warwick's given his talk. So I'm just looking at the chat box there.
And just a reminder that there are 2 ways to ask questions. You can either pop notes in the chat box at the side, or you can raise your virtual hand from the menu bar in the participant section. Or you can wait till after Warwick has spoken if you'd like to ask questions then.
Okay, well, we might hand over to Warwick, perhaps Katie.
Sounds like a good idea. So handing over next to Warwick Ragg, who is the General Manager, Natural Resource Management at National Farmers Federation. Warwick has been around this sort of policy discussion for many, many years. He can tell you a little bit more about his background if you'd like to, or we can just throw straight to Warwick and I'm going to run the slides for him from my end. And let me just get that going.
Thanks, Katie. And while that's happening, I'll just give you a bit of background. So for those of you who don't know me, and there are some people here I've known for a while, My previous lives have included a decade in the 90s at New South Wales Farmers Association, so out in the regions, and got me a pretty clear understanding of the sort of things that work and don't work in a farm sector. And the early 2000s, I spent as the Chief Executive Officer of an industry association called Australian Forest Growers. And part of my role there was to sit on one of the, I think, only 4 standards development organisation boards in Australia as an inaugural director. And in my role as representing small growers, it was pretty clear that the complexity and the onerous nature of certification schemes were quite difficult for small and medium growers in particular to A, participate in, but B, do so in an economic sense. Now, it was made worse for forestry because forestry is quite a long-term crop and the incomes are sort of not before 7 years, but really realistically not before 20 plus years. So early investment in a certification scheme you couldn't offset with an income is a bit of a struggle. So, I mean, I guess from an NFF perspective, the question I continue to get asked in relation to this project is, why are you doing it? And there's probably 3 answers to that. The first one and most glib answer is that the Commonwealth saw the need for a scheme and identified National Farmers Federation as someone who was well placed to deliver that. The second is, and next slide please, Katie, that the NFF released in 2018 its 2030 roadmap, which was basically, I guess, a vision document for Australian agriculture's plan for a $100 billion industry by 2030. I'd have to say, ever since that's been released, it's either been dry or we've been under the burden of COVID or bushfires or any and all of the above. So that's increasingly looking like an ambitious target, but one that we're continuing to work our way towards. And so that roadmap is broken into what we call 5 pillars, and probably the one that's of most relevance to this discussion is what we call pillar 2, which is growing sustainably. And it's got a few targets in there that sort of inform where we're going with this strategy. So the first one is that the net benefit for ecosystem services, and I stress that, the net benefit, so after the costs, for ecosystem services is equal to 5% of farm revenue. So in the context of the 2030 roadmap, that's $5 billion a year, every year, in ecosystem services. That's a significant amount of money, and one that's probably not going to be provided as either grants or other mechanisms from the public purse, at least on an ongoing basis, if at all. And so we'll come back to the different investment horizons or characteristics that might be relevant here. The second one there is that Australian agriculture is trending towards carbon neutrality by 2030. So again, we're seeing, and Richard's touched on this in quite some detail, community expectations underpinning a market of work, which, you know, depending on who you talk to, has various levels of success, but is nevertheless an investment in some outcomes. And we'd like to see a higher price for carbon. We'd like to see more competition in the marketplace, and we'd like to see better capacity for small and medium farmers to participate in the carbon market. But nevertheless, what we've got is at least a framework to operate in. The third one, and really not that relevant here, is to halve food waste by 2030. And just quickly on that, we're looking at what the contribution of agriculture might be inside the farm gate for that. So things like harvested but not marketed produce, or alternative uses for crops may be options there. And the final one is just kind of a general statement about, I think, what most of us on this webinar would like, which is the aspiration to maintain the access to farmland under the burden of increasing urban development and or mining and other things. So next slide, please, Katie. The second or third reason, the second key tranche of why we're interested is as a consequence of discussion amongst our members and brought to the NFF table, we've developed, and which was finalised in May 19, a natural capital policy, which has a number of characteristics. We've identified that there's an absence of a market-based systems that effectively assigns value to natural capital and the various services provided by the environment. Now, natural capital is, and again, Richard alluded to this, natural capital is I guess, the broadest definition of our natural assets. So it includes things like carbon, biodiversity, sustainable farm systems, water quality, effectiveness of dams, a whole range of sort of biophysical properties that can and should, in our opinion, lend themselves to a market. We've also determined through that process that we don't know enough about the cost of the externalities for agriculture in Australia. So, you know, we know that there's a community expectation that native vegetation, threatened species need to be maintained, and there's some legislative rules around that. What's missing in that is that those requirements have a cost to agriculture and have a benefit to the broader community, and there's not yet an effective mechanism to bridge that gap and provide that investment into the public good conservation outcomes that the farm sector is providing at private cost. And again, not knowing enough about what we're trying to solve, so we need some good investment into those systems. And the bottom line there, again, is Australia, we manage 51% of the land mass. We want to maintain that land mass. But equally, given that's the case, and given that we're most actively involved in that land scope, we need to ensure that we're paid fair and equitable returns for all of the products and services that those properties provide. Next slide, please. Sorry. So we've been thinking for a little while about how we might go about doing this. So for us, there's kind of three key tranches to go about developing a market for biophysical assets. The first one is that we need to be sure that we've got metrics that are easily accessible, easily developed, easily understood, and scientifically robust. The second one is we need to find some mechanism of putting that data into some digitised frame to ensure that the efficiencies of the 21st century can also be available to agriculture. And from our perspective, the more information you can have available to you at low cost and in a robust digital sense, the less cost there's going to be for the intervention of people with clipboards, if you like, to undertake certification or verification schemes. The third tranche, and I kind of alluded to this before, is really what this slide goes to, which is to find the people to invest in that, in those outcomes, whether it's for biodiversity, whether it's for carbon, or whether it's for any other of those natural capital attributes. And so we partnered late last year with KPMG to develop and release a report called Return on Nature, which is available, publicly available. Effectively, what we were trying to do there is close that sort of missing link of who would invest in these sorts of assets. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the governments, with the best will in the world, are not going to put the sort of $5 billion a year on the table, you know, on a continual basis. So we need to diversify the income streams. it's the case in my mind, and I'll continue to advocate for that, that there's a role for government to play, particularly where they are requiring outcomes through their legislative processes, to ensure that that they're investing in those outcomes. So whether they're threatened species laws, whether they're vegetation retention laws, those things that are being forced on agriculture and are not able to be compensated, at least to this point, need the attention to ensure that they are appropriately rewarded. And we'd argue that that's the government acting on behalf of the public, and the public should invest in that. But again, to Richard's point about it being broader than that and being opportunities to the greater resilience of agriculture, we think there's more. So whilst the Crake Review recommended that there should be $1 billion a year in a National Biodiversity Conservation Trust, we think there's more opportunities for private investment, both national and international. Again, in the context of the ESG discussion that Richard was referring to. So to give those people that need to now go and defend what's in their annual reports and balance sheets. So it's becoming the case now that claims by public companies about their ESG or CSG, corporate social responsibility claims, need to be able to quantify those. So they can't just say we're clean and green. They now need to say we're clean and green, and my auditors have had a look, and here's where we've invested in that outcome. So that's an opportunity to provide a product for them to invest in, and we're taking the view that there needs to be a mechanism to allow them to invest with confidence. It's a financial instrument. Those financial instruments need to ensure that there is a capacity to have an ongoing investment in a reliable product, with a set of rules that may not be very different to the types of rules that need to be complied with in other financial sectors like the stock market. So there might need to be some financial services rules. There'll be philanthropic investment, there'll be equity investment, there'll be balance sheet investments by people with ESG aspirations, or there could be more greatly leveraged opportunities. A whole range of opportunities are there, and return on nature is kind of the starting point for that, those sets of outcomes. Next slide, please, Katie. So again, to the context of what brought us here, in the budget announced in March for confirmation in the April budget, remembering the budget was a month early last year to cater for an election. The government announced a $34 million package that covered three tranches. An agricultural biodiversity policy, which is continuing to develop and will be substantially informed not only by this $4 million project, but also by the outcomes of the other $30 million of the $34 million package, which is the Agriculture Stewardship Pilot Program. So again, we're trying to pull together, beyond the Farm Biodiversity Scheme, opportunities for farm stewardship, and going back to those points I made earlier about good metrics, good data, and good financial instruments. We're continuing to work with the government on what that $30 million investment might look like, have been doing so for about 12 months, and we'll continue to do so until we help them hopefully land on what is a sensible pathway forward to get some legacy outcomes on that. Next slide, please. So the third tranche being the Farm Biodiversity Certification Pilot. So we've got this project. We're looking to integrate productivity, sustainability and biodiversity on Australian farms to provide lasting benefits to farmers and the community, to ensure farmers can show best practice, sustainability and biodiversity management of natural resources, including sustainable farm practices, and to ensure that these outcomes are recognisable in a robust manner by the wider community. As Richard has clearly outlined, this process so far is widely consultative. We anticipate the rest of the project being the same. Phase one is the development or the understanding, and which AFI are doing. And so we really want to analyse the domestic and international systems and what people are thinking, what the art of the possible is, I guess, for Australian agriculture. The second phase will be to take the learnings from phase one and to develop what I guess I'd call some best bets. So let's have a look at what the art of the possible is. Let's not forget that there's a whole range of industry schemes out there already that are quite commodity focused. Let's try and see if there's some opportunities there where we can better align some of those schemes. Will it be a meta standard, a certification scheme, a verification scheme, or simply some sort of enhanced labelling scheme? We don't know, but we want to explore that. And in terms of the best bets, we probably want a mixture of things so that we can take that to a marketplace and test it in a pilot sense, which is phase three. So phase three is to assess farmer and the value chain readiness for any of those schemes that we're choosing to pilot, and conduct a trial of the scheme. So the ultimate outcome of the project is to have something that's well consulted, understood by a range of stakeholders, has some capacity or expectation that it can be successfully implemented, and hopefully also a pathway to implementation without actually having implemented it, because we don't think that we can implement something like this in even a 3-year time frame. So harking back to my earlier example of the Australian Forestry Standard, I think we spent a decade discussing about whether it was an appropriate thing to do. Having got everyone to agree that we should do it, it then took over 5 years to actually go through the process of fully consulting and designing the scheme, to the point that we could get national and international buy-in on it. Next slide, please, Katie. And so, building again on some of the examples Richard gave, we've had a presence at most of the consultations, and I guess these are our sort of conclusions about what the producers that are there have thought about this. The first finding is that it's a crowded, convoluted and confusing space. There's multiple systems, there's multiple standards, everyone's got the best idea. When this was originally announced, I had need to create a specific folder in my Outlook for all the people that rang me up and told me that they had the best scheme going, and could I have $4 million please, so I can just go and implement my scheme a bit more broadly. We took the view that there were a number of schemes out there, and that we needed to do some independent assessment of that, and in doing so, implemented the project in the way I previously described. It's different in industries. We've, all got a different perspective on where the priority sectors put their different CSG inputs. Some sectors are quite well developed. So cotton, for example, has a BMP. Some other sectors have ISO 9000 based schemes. Other sectors are still in the process of developing sustainability matrices, etc. And it's ongoingly frustrating that there's no ongoing investment in this. Hence the need to make sure that whatever we develop has a legacy characteristic, and that it's not reliant only on government funding. So government funding is very hit and miss. You can have it sort of a couple of years and then it disappears, and it might come back again in a couple of years for another 3-year tranche. So the bottom line there for us, excuse me, is we must find a way to standardise and make comparable and compatible either common standards or common schemes with common data. very clearly in our mind is that the absolute majority, not absolute, the clear majority of farms are mixed farms. And to date, we've done a really good job of developing commodity-specific frameworks that mean an individual farmer has to be across a number of them. Question in our minds are, without losing the complexity and the importance of those, whether there's something we can do to bring them all together in what I might loosely call a farm care model. The second finding, Katie, next slide please, is that no single investment dollar or no single metric, and when I say metrics, I'm thinking, you know, carbon, biodiversity, sustainable farm metrics, whatever, is likely to be enough. So we've seen in carbon that there's very, very low uptake in a number of areas. That's got to do with scale, it's got to do with the nature of it, it's got to do with the poor capacity to measure soil carbon efficiently, and it's interesting to see where it's rolled out. So those areas where it does have some traction are, I guess, more of the rangeland country, where they've been able to set aside land for carbon, where land is not necessarily a limiting factor. So they're quite large holdings, and on more closer in and intensive properties, that's more problematic. If we did the same for biodiversity, we'd find again that there's simply not enough money at the moment to do that and cover the cost of doing so. And so what that's seen us default to is a range of grant or, you know, land carry NRM funding options that by and large are grants investing in inputs rather than necessarily outcomes, and suffer again from the ebb and flow. So if we can find a way, and that's what we're trying to get our head around in this project, if we can find a way to standardise a sort of set of stacked remuneration or incentives, then we think that's got some capacity to work in the marketplace. Next slide. So please, Katie, the final finding is that in addition to everything I just said in relation to finding two, it's really hard to demonstrate that return. People feel good about fetching riparian zones. They feel good about, you know, limited access to dams, and we think there's good biophysical outcomes for that. We think there's good sustainable farm practices in that, but we really don't have a good demonstration of what that return is. So again, harking back to my earlier comments, we need good metrics. We need them to have a value so that we can demonstrate a return on investment. And to do that, we need players in the marketplace and multiple players in the marketplace. And inevitably, again, the silo type approach that agriculture is quite good at. Records and outputs are non-standardised. They're different for each scheme. The verification metrics are often different too. And they often line up with short-term and ad hoc funding streams that are largely grant focused, not performance driven. And a lot of them have little or no scientific basis in either farm or production focused programs or in the assessment of environmental outcomes. So to justify additional funds, these failings must be solved, but existing agencies and programs lack capacity to do so. So again, we're looking at, you know, is there a pathway here to, I guess what I described as a meta standard or a one ring type option that allows a whole lot of modules to exist, and in doing so, do we develop a sort of sustainable farm system or biodiversity or some other module? Next slide, please, Katie. So I'll just finish on this, and I've kind of alluded to a few of these as I've gone through. As I said, we're hoping that this report will inform the development of phase 2, which will extract some best bet options and have those used as the things to be piloted in phase 3. We're continuing to talk with the department in relation to the Ag Stewardship Program, and we've established a stakeholder reference committee, which is basically representatives of our member organisations to provide sort of a benchmarking and oversight process. So there's some specific decisions to be made as a consequence of this project. Is there a scope for an umbrella standard or verification scheme? Can we come up with some harmonised data systems or rules? What are the linkages back to Landcare and NRM programs? Are they the people to help deliver it on the ground? Have they got some landscape mapping, etc., that's available that can be used as informative on development of metrics? Can we link this to the Climate Solutions Fund, the ERF portion of it, the Emissions Reduction Fund, in a sort of carbon plus context? So could we have carbon plus biodiversity plus, I don't know, sustainable farm metrics? I don't know, sustainable landscape metrics. Can we link this to other natural capital frameworks? There are existing standards starting to be developed. We need to benchmark those and find out if they're the appropriate ones. Explore the linkages and or complementarity to international schemes. A lot of the capital that's talked about in the KPMG report is likely to be international, though that was written obviously before COVID. So their estimation of $1 trillion being available for mobilisation might be now a little bit at risk. And in that context, do we need trading instruments? Or sorry, we will need trading instruments and or rules, and how do we go about developing those? And finally, how do we go about developing standards or systems to give these outcomes? So that's kind of an overview of the broader thinking, I guess, of NFF and how we're sort of developing this project and having broader discussions about that whole, I think, quite vexed issue of how to best value multiple outputs from an agricultural system and to assist as far as possible to make agricultural systems more resilient going forward than perhaps they are now. So with that, Katie, I think Richard, I'll leave it there, and happy to participate in the discussion.
Thanks, Warwick. So I've had a lot of very interesting questions come up in the chat, and remembering that you can also raise your hands if you would like to speak, and because you're automatically muted, if you would like to talk, it's polite way to engage would be to put up your little virtual hand, or you can try and wave if you feel like it, although it's a bit hard for me to see everybody. There's a lot of people in the meeting, but we might just scan through the questions at the side there. So I'll get Richard and Warwick. We didn't also introduce earlier Oscar Pearce, who's a project manager working with NFF to bring this project to reality. So Oscar, you can just give everyone a little wave so they can see who you are. There's Oscar as well. So we'll get these three people to respond for us. So just a very quick, this is not related to the topic at hand, but Sandy had asked me if the regional presentations will be shared, that we've recorded as well. We're not sharing those recordings only because a lot of that was consultation with people breaking off into little workshop groups and having questions that they answered and discussing amongst themselves. Largely the content that was broadcast in those regional forums is similar to what you've seen today, perhaps a little less depth because there was more time for the workshop sessions, but the webinars themselves will be uploaded to the website so people can see what we're talking about today. People who couldn't join us today can actually hear what you've heard this afternoon as well. So we've got some notes there from Alex. I might get you to talk to that a bit later, Alex, because there's some comments there rather than questions. But Derek has asked, is there an opportunity to get consumers and retailers to fund or partly fund the scheme rather than farmers? There are so many costs put upon farmers, including improving and supporting biodiversity, with a possible return benefit in the future. Value-adding customers, manufacturers, retailers and wholesalers are the ones who directly benefit because they have the marketing power. Farmers could opt in and put their efforts into the on-farm work. So Richard, Warwick, Oscar, would you like to talk about that?
Sure, look, I'll start first. There are very few, if any, schemes internationally that I can think of where the cost of participating in the scheme in terms of certification costs, measurement baselines, all that sort of stuff, have been contributed to directly by consumers, retailers, whoever may be benefiting from it. What does happen is more that there is a premium that might be achieved for the product that is produced through the scheme, and then the premium needs to be more than the costs incurred. And if it's not, then there's no value proposition for participating, obviously. But there is nothing that I can think of where there's been a more direct pathway for others further down the supply chain to pay the direct costs of participating in a scheme. And I think that would be, to be honest, I think that would be unlikely to be embraced by others in the supply chain.
So, I agree with everything Richard said. So, for my sins, I quite often get put in a room with people who represent a range of international high-end labels, for example, who come and say, for example, we want to buy wool from non-mulesed sheep. And you go, okay, well, we can facilitate that. What sort of premium are you prepared to pay to do that? And they're going, oh, we just want wool from non-mulesed sheep. We just want you to meet our demands. We're not going to pay any premium for that. And that's just one example of how the market and the consumer just doesn't prepare directly to invest in these things. But Derek, I hope you got from my presentation that what we're trying to do is design something slightly differently that allows a market to develop to fund the outcomes or the things that might be certified in this project. So what's lacking at the moment is a viable, robust and transparent national or international marketplace for those sorts of biophysical assets that we've described. So rather than paying for the cost of the scheme, you'd, in my opinion, invest in the scheme only if you knew that there was a marketplace there that was going to provide you a return to justify you doing so. And in the context of the narrow scope of the biodiversity certification, and reiterating Richard's point that it's absolutely voluntary, if you are going to enter into something like this, given the complexity it's likely to have in a compliance and measurement sense, then you'll want the support of a scheme or a marketplace that can provide you an income. Otherwise, why would you do it? And that's kind of the starting position of us. If you've got to go, if you're relying on farmers to do this out of the goodness of their hearts, then that's unfair. And if community demands it in the context of public good, conservation demands, then the community should invest in that. Most of what I talked about was exploring opportunities for how we might create that model where it doesn't currently exist.
One other element factoring in there with the idea that consumer-driven demand and a price premium that, people paying significant amounts of funding for additional non-functional attributes, whatever they are, whether it's a biodiversity or a natural capital or a sustainable practice or exclusion of certain practices, it's always been demonstrated to have a relatively small market uptake, and the premium might be there in some cases, but it's a relatively small part of the total market, both domestically and export. Interesting discussing with a cotton marketer over the weekend, the BCI, Better Cotton Initiative, which traditionally has started with a good margin that eroded rapidly as domestic supply. Domestic supply was relatively good. I'm sorry, I've had a child. Domestic supply was good. The international supply massively outstripped it and created almost no premium for a while. But only recently, as a result of some COVID and geopolitical issues, that premium has tripled. Now, if you were looking at the long-term average, that would be no basis for engagement. So there are issues within the cotton industry over that massive wax and wane of a market premium that's just simply a result of the supply and demand changing. If you base your system purely on those consumer predilections, you will find that they move continuously over time, and they make it something that's very difficult to do your long-term farm planning on the basis of, because it simply is something that is there one day and not 3, 6, 12 months later.
Alex, could I get you to tell us a little bit about the scheme that your council is looking at that's aligning rural and biodiversity strategies to look for these opportunities?
Sure. Hi, everybody. And Oscar, we've all been there. My kids are likely to run behind me as well. So I'm a senior strategic land use planner at Mid Coast Council. We were merged nearly 4 years ago. We've been working through a whole range of strategy development, including a rural strategy, which is about 98% of our land mass in the Mid Coast. We have significant environmental and other biodiversity valuable locations, including significant waterways, Ramsar wetlands, etc. So a lot of strategic work has come out of our merger. And as part of our discussions, we're trying to put together a biodiversity framework, which gives us a flexible framework to assess, identify, and map biodiversity, connectivity, EEC, threatened species, etc. That is in coordination with our Hunter JO, which was formerly known as HECRMS, the Hunter Central Coast Environmental Management Scheme, I think they were called. And they have also done broad scale mapping of biodiversity throughout the Hunter regional plan scope. So I coordinate the rural strategy. We're also looking at ways of increasing the value and income viability for our farmers. We have significant marginal lands. Obviously, we've got a lot of coastal lands, hinterland. We do have a shrinking dairy and beef industry, but we do have one of the largest beef abattoirs in the state, and we have significant niche industry growth in our region. And certainly with climate change and mining and various other factors, we also have a trend of migration of market gardening, cut flowers, honey production, etc., into the mid-coast from the Sydney Basin. And certainly we have had also significant fire impact. So we are looking at exploring different ways to connect the two opportunities through those two strategy documents. We are also lucky in that in our LGA, we have an environmental levy, which is fixed at 6% and is a permanent levy attached to rates. We're also in, as a merged council, again, looking at rate harmonisation. And the question I put earlier with regards to how involved is the local land services group and local council is because we have significant pressures for from farming communities on marginal land or in retirement age, looking to rezone and subdivide and cut up what we consider to be our most valuable agricultural land around Barrington, Gloucester, and in very large holdings, in very sensitive environments in some cases. And we are trying to provide other economic streams for those landowners, either to hold on to the properties themselves, provide that secondary income, diversify their agricultural activity, but also potentially look at native food gathering, either through cultural practices or farming, because we have got that changeable environment. We have certainly got less water scarcity than some LGAs, but we also have a very well-developed water management program, and we also have our water and sewer supply operators now within the council as well. So we have significant opportunities to bring all of those programs into alignment, including our recycled water programs, which have already been trialled in the Manning Valley. So we are definitely looking at this as an option and an opportunity for our landholders. We do see that there is that market opportunity, some of which is provided through our links with that Hunter JO, and are using our environmental levy to undertake some of the investigative work at the beginning stages of trying to put stewardship or certification in motion. And the pressure we're getting is through rezoning. So there is an opportunity there as well if we are able to identify sections of farming land that can't be used viably for agriculture because they are too steep or too sensitive, that they are rezoned for environmental purposes. They go through a certification or stewardship program. The credits are on-sold, but they are managed by the landowner. And then they can also potentially get rate rebates for that conservation land. So we're looking at that full cycle. Again, our strategies and framework are in very early stages, but all of the challenges outlined in Richard's presentation are certainly ones that we are looking at and seeing how we can provide those mechanisms or those linkages without having to understand or have a reliable credit value from the Biodiversity Trust, for example, but targeting it within our circle of influence and including that rate rebate option as we move forward.
Thanks, Alex. Warwick or Richard, did you want to comment on any of that? Or I think we can take it more or less as a comment, as an example of the complexity, but willingness of people to get stuck into this. It does tie in, you mentioned, Alex, a few times water there and water management. And Libby's got a question about how all of this fits with water policy. Increasing the availability of water in one part of a system usually reduces it in another and impacts natural systems. What's the thinking around these challenges and meeting the needs of various stakeholder objectives, which can often be competing objectives?
The short answer is that this project is not specifically addressing water policy. However, as I mentioned at the beginning, the sorts of measurement mechanisms, commonality of frameworks, of understanding how you're defining an environmental asset, those sorts of things would tie in with some of the questions that you're asking, you know, just in the being able to measure the impact better than we are at the moment. So in that context, it's related, but it's not going to attempt to directly address water policy as part of this project.
I mean, I guess I'd just add to that. I don't think we've got time to have an expansive water policy debate here. I'm up for that, but not in this forum. I'll just say, Libby, in relation to that, I'm not sure whether you're referring specifically to the Murray-Darling Basin or more broadly. I think my high-level comment would be there are going to continue to be ongoing competing objectives for water. We're water limited in this country. I'd say that if it related to the Murray-Darling Basin, they've gone some way in identifying that natural systems need their own allocation, for want of better terminology, or entitlement. And so there is already progress on identifying what is, you know, consumptive versus environmental needs. But as Richard said, it's really kind of probably beyond the scope of this project.
Another couple of questions still in the chat there. Has the value of Australia's clean and green image been calculated as has been done in New Zealand? It's a pretty straightforward answer as far as I know. That's a no. Warwick or Richard?
No, and look, Oscar's sort of answered it there in his reply a little bit as well. I'm not aware of a number as such, other than saying so many of particularly our premium export markets have been based on the premise that, well, you know, the understanding of the consumers that are accessing, that are buying the products in those markets, that the Australian produce is clean and green. And there is lots and lots of anecdotal evidence of that. There is also an increasing amount of anecdotal evidence that those same consumers are now being much more picky and much more demanding about the evidence of that provenance that's attached to it. And so, as Oscar's put there, without the ability to demonstrate, then our existing markets are potentially under threat going forward.
I suppose one of the things that we're aware that, I mean, this isn't necessarily a pure market access in the sense of the old, technical barriers to trade or SBS agreements or protocols being put in place. It might be one thing for a country to have a specific requirement, and obviously there's been some discussions in the media, and there's been a lot more within a few market access orientated government departments about what's happening in Europe, and particularly with British livestock and meat production importation requirements. So watch this space. The reality is not every country is going to do similar things to Europe, but individual major purchases within those importing countries may do so. And it may be a stepped process too, where an individual importer might choose to introduce a scheme or a system or a series of requirements to depth for producers to supply that market to demonstrate, and that gradually increases over time. It is something to keep aware of, because there's several examples when new requirements have come in just in the last 12 months for producers that want to export into some of those higher value markets.
A quick question to address, which is further up from Richard. The collaborations with MLA and Carbon Neutral 2030, broader all-encompassing mutual benefit to farmers and community. And you mentioned also the Land to Market and Savory Institute and other EOV bodies. Just to reiterate that we are consulting very, very widely, and we have had a lot of people. This would be our 12th online event that we've run, and there have been a lot of people from a lot of very different backgrounds, and that's my dog barking now, that have participated and provided their opinion as well. I'm going to skip ahead to another question. Richard, Heath, could you just read out the questions while I shush my dog, please?
Sure. So just the one, there's been a couple of questions there just about involvement of other groups, LLS, NRM groups. As Katie just said, yeah, look, we're consulting as widely as we can, and we're certainly speaking to a lot of NRM groups, local government, LLS, so on. Yeah, the short answer is yes, they'll be critical. As I said before, in the feedback that we've had so far through all the consultations, any successful scheme has inevitably had really good local involvement, ground up involvement. Anything that's sort of come from top down has generally been not very successful. So NRM groups, in particular the ones that have had very high levels of local involvement and very strong farmer engagement, and there's plenty of them out there that that are good examples of that, will be critical for engagement and rollout of such a scheme. So yes, is the short answer to that, to those sorts of groups being involved.
And just in terms of the timing and opportunity is there, the NRM groups, and if you're in New South Wales, that's your local land services region. 56 NRM groups around the country are closing in on the end of a 12 to 18 month process to update their local biodiversity or ecosystem plans. So there's a resource there that can assist producers in planning, but it's difficult at the moment in some cases to translate those general local plans into a specific set of practices on your farm, and it's certainly not something that you've got a standardised measure for. So that would be a logical first step, to find a way to integrate those NRM group plans into something that is actually measurable, so that you as an individual producer could reference check to see where you're up to in the context of your local NRM region. But yeah, nearly everyone should be seeing them, if not now, then certainly within the next 6 months, because they're all being updated and sent out to all producer stakeholders across the country.
And then I'll just add the national peak body for the NRM regions Australia is a member of our reference group, so directly involved in it.
It's a great question that's just come up there at the end. I don't know the answer, but I'm going to have a stab at it. Where are we at currently with % farm gate revenue from ecosystem services? Warwick's probably got the answer because NFF would have done all the background work to get it into the document. No, he's shaking his head. I said that tongue in cheek. So look, I mean, the biggest fund, I guess, you know, in terms of trying to gauge the sorts of levels that have been out there to this point, would be the old emissions reduction fund, now the climate solutions fund, I think it's called.
Yep.
And I think, you know, at its peak, it was 50 million a year. Is that about right? So it's, you know, that's far less than 1%. That's in the, you know, points of percentage. And then beyond that, there's lots of smaller projects, as we've talked about. You know, almost sort of all the ecosystem services work has been project-based through NRM groups, through state government programs, just 5-year funding buckets, 10-year funding buckets. Nothing, you know, of anything near the significance of the emissions reduction fund bucket of money. So the answer is very low at this point. Certainly substantially less than 1%.
Yeah, with rounding probably closer to 0.
I was going to say substantially less than 0.1%.
Yeah.
I'm just scanning the other questions.
I'm not sure which questions you answered while I was out of the room.
So there's one there about NRM groups rolling out the certification process. Are we that far down yet?
Yeah.
So just on that, aid is it so the first presumption is that it'll be a certification process, and I don't know that we've necessarily landed that yet. Hopefully it's some sort of process. That said, it's very strong in my mind, at least, that if we're going to roll this out at any scale and successfully, we'll need some credible people on the ground to do so. And the most logical pathway to do that is that sort of NRM regional planning framework, which for us, the NRM group seem well placed to provide. You probably have to upskill some people to do so, but in terms of a model with a local presence and with some local understanding and influence, it makes sense to us.
I'm just going to go back to a question that we didn't cover previously, because I think it's a really important one and a good one, about farmers that are already delivering biodiversity outcomes, not getting a benefit. They're just doing it because they think it's a good thing to do. And, you know, does it mean that schemes are only targeted at farmers who aren't doing it at the moment and wouldn't do it without a financial gain? There is precedent internationally where, and this sort of gets to the point that I was making in my presentation initially about additionality. And there is precedent in schemes that have been based on additionality where it's actually led to really perverse outcomes where farmers have deliberately essentially degraded some land so they could then participate in a scheme and get a benefit out of it. Now that is absolutely, you know, that is a really perverse, bad outcome that of, you know, a badly designed scheme. And so understanding how farmers that are already delivering really good outcomes are not put at a disadvantage through a new scheme is, for me, a really, really important part of getting something, you know, a successful design in a new scheme.
And I don't know that Richard and I have a different view, but maybe we do. So let me come at this a different way. The concept of additionality is a core concept for sequestration of carbon, and it's as a consequence of international agreements that say that if you are going to sequester carbon, then it has to be new carbon, and therefore it has to be additional. And Richard's absolutely right. There's a range of, landscape management schemes around the world. Probably best not try and name them, that perversely give you an incentive to stop doing what you're doing. Where I think we need to continue to test is that existing quality farming systems or biodiversity characteristics are necessarily requiring additional activity. It's my current working view, and I'm expecting to have this argument severally, that if you've got a quality landscape, corridor system or, highly sustainable pasture system, that should be able to be classified as that quality and be consistent with what I think it certainly used to be in the New South Wales legislation, which was to maintain or improve. And so the maintenance of that quality system ought to have a value, perhaps not as high as a value of an enhanced system, but it ought to have an inherent value that the market ought to invest in. Now, that's very different for carbon, and that ship has sailed, but I'm still defending the ground that we don't need to have everything as additional to participate in a market for other biophysical assets.
Taking that on as well, I mean, there was also a few questions. There's one from Bob about the biodiversity offset systems that are used by developers, etc. And a second question from Alex about engagement with DPI&E. In New South Wales, there's a biodiversity system that does create an offset. In theory, it's a tradable market, but I mean, primarily the major income stream there is on those offsets from and the prices are extremely low. So I mean, they're not even covering rents, or in some cases the New South Wales program doesn't even cover the costs of your local government rates. So the systems that have been developed so far are very much below, looking at an opportunity cost or a production loss cost. So ensuring that we can, as Warwick said, deal with the additionality in the right way, and finding income streams to protect and conserve existing assets has got to be critical. And that is quite a deviation from the majority of incentive programs that have been rolled out across the country in state or territory jurisdictions in the past.
So following on from that, there's a question about biodiversity offset schemes receiving funding from corporates who are found guilty of engagement in unscrupulous behaviour. I think we might have covered that in the perverse outcomes discussion, unless anybody wants to add a bit more to that.
I'd just say as a general principle that those types of offset schemes only move, as I think you kind of alluded to, Katie, only move the environmental burden to another place geographically. They don't actually solve it in situ. I'm not a huge fan of those offset schemes, to be honest.
Question from Roz about COVID impacts on reduced premiums. I think that means, Roz, for organic production at the moment. And I suppose that's an example of that fact that we talked about earlier, that consumer predilection to pay for particular attributes can change. And in this case, it has turned on a dime. One of the concepts behind where this program could go would be to create a system that allows you to hold your data and that's been put together in certification or verification in a number of existing schemes. And so that if a premium drops off because consumer patterns change, that you still have your data, that you still have your information about your production practices, even if you choose to withdraw from a particular production system or accreditation or certification system. So, I mean, that's one element in terms of if there were to be harmonised super standards, umbrella standards, potentially another outcome could be to develop some way of holding your data so that if you choose to go in and out of a different program, that you've still got the core information. You haven't lost years of good work and good recording systems because you've changed programs. That's come up as well in terms of NRM funding and land care funding, where the short-term nature of some of those grants means people get involved, do the recording, and then once the funding's gone, they simply withdraw and the recording process stops, and that data gets essentially lost. So giving it a new life, and a lot of that information that you might have collected from a land care project 5 years ago could be very relevant in helping you put together a natural capital argument for a bank in these days. So making losing that information and data could be a really important element of this project as well.
I'll just make a quick comment too, just in relation to that COVID-19 question and the opportunity that might provide as well. It is actually interesting with the impact that it's having on investment markets globally, and the speculation about how that might impact on agriculture. I know it's really early and there's still going to be huge implications going forward, and just a general decline in probably, investment levels and everything. However, at this stage, it appears to be, and I participated in a call with a really big venture capital company just last week, that the appetite and opportunity for investment into agricultural opportunities, and particularly into anything that is targeting some form of sustainable agriculture, has not declined at all. Is still really strong, and lots of people still looking for opportunities there. So I think it's it is really showing up the opportunity that exists. There's a question there about, is there any way to speed the trial up? Well, I can say is there's certainly lots of pressure to do that. Yeah, so look, we're going as fast as we can. The subsequent phases, I think, Oscar or Warwick might want to come in again just to confirm the timeline of the application of the trial.
So yes, there is discussions about whether we can do it quicker. I think the risk is that if we don't do a fully consultative process for all of the phases, then we can't have the confidence that the ag sector and downstream have been effectively engaged and fully understand the pros and cons of what's being proposed. I've got very little doubt that you could stick half a dozen very smart people in a room and they could hatch something, and we could roll it out and cheer that it was all wonderful. But I'm really conscious of making sure we bring a whole range of people along for the journey, which is why this first phase has been so intensively consultative. And whilst we're still designing phases 2 and 3, we're imagining that there'll be a high level of referring back to those people that are likely to be affected and getting good information from them about where the shortcomings are.
There's a question there about rebalancing unfair international world trade through biodiversity payments, or ESG payments of some kind. And there's actually a report that came out from AgriFutures just last month, International Agricultural Subsidies and Their Impact on Australian Agriculture, by Kim Anderson, who's a very well-respected ag economist that's been involved in all sorts of negotiations for international trade agreements with all sorts of organisations for years and years. And the finding of that report was essentially that, pretty much confirming exactly what that question says, in that the impact of tariffs is still huge for Australian agriculture, sort of costing potential, or there could potentially be up to 29% more exports of Australian agricultural goods than there are now if there weren't for tariffs, and really arguing for continuing enforcement and support of the WTO process to remove as many tariffs as we can, apart from the need for environmental payments for Australian farmers. So it's interesting, just a very strong support of free markets and WTO process, but really pointing out that Australia is falling behind the rest of the world in payments for ecosystem services and protection of natural capital, and that's really what needs to be a focus of the Australian government going forward.
Which is a pretty good note to more or less wrap up on, unless anybody's got any final questions. I'm conscious of the time. We only have 10 more minutes allotted. We don't have to use all of them. It's been quite an interesting, quite a deep discussion this afternoon, but this is your chance to put up any final questions or comments. We will be saving the notes off to the side for the project team as well, so feel free to pop any extra comments in there on schemes that you think we must include or might not have mentioned, or, as I said, any final questions.
I just wanted to say the NFF project has a stakeholder reference committee. That's and look, the details are on the NFF website. The stakeholder reference committee has organisations, peak bodies, and state farmer organisations, members of NFF, as well as Warwick mentioned, the NRM regions. So chances are you'll probably be a member of one or some of those organisations. So there is a direct feedback loop if you are a member of those groups, and looking forward to continuing that. We're having an ongoing discussion with them. They'll continue to have a role in this process all the way through. So there's always that output. So whether it's AgForce in Queensland, New South Wales Farmers, VFF, keep talking to your state farmer organisation or peak body.
One more.
In lieu of any raised hands or further questions, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you very much to our speakers for giving such a detailed presentation for everybody. We'll be uploading this recording to the AFI website sometime this week, we hope. We will email all the attendees, and you are free to pass that link around to other people who couldn't make it today. And thanks very much for your participation. I should just say too, I'm not a complete nerd. I only have Star Wars background because it's May the 4th. May the 4th be with you all. It's too late. They've all left.
Live long and prosper? Oh, wrong one.
That's the wrong one.
Bye-bye.
Messages before I shut the meeting.